welcome to the Step Stories podcast. I'm your host, Robin Breuner. Thanks so much for being with us here today. I have a guest who I cannot wait to talk to. Her name is Mallary Tenore Tarpley. Did I say that right, Mallary?
Yes.
Good. Oh, I'm glad. Thanks so much for joining me. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. So happy to be chatting with you.
I am too. I just loved your book, and we're going to get to that in 1 second. I want to tell our listeners a little bit about you. And also, I'm just getting over a cold, so my voice sounds a little froggy, but I got some nice hot tea here, so will keep me from hopefully coughing. Mallary is a journalism and writing professor at the University of Texas at Austin's Moody College of Communication and Macomb School of Business. Your writing has appeared in tons of places: the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, the Washington Post. I could go on and on. Los Angeles Times, Teen Vogue. And you live outside of Austin. I want to hear a little bit more about that with your husband and two children. And you've just written your first book called Slip: Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery. So I know that you have more accolades and awards and different things. So we will put all of that in your bio in our show notes. But tell me a little bit about your family. 2 kids. What are you doing for this summer?
Sure. So I have 2 kids, a daughter who's 10 and a son who's 8. And so this summer we are juggling work and camps and also fitting in some vacation. We're going to Boston and Cape Cod. I'm from Massachusetts originally, so it will be nice to go there. And we've never actually taken the kids to Boston proper. Usually we fly into Logan Airport and then drive out to the suburbs to see family, but we're going to spend some time in the actual city because I think they're old enough now to really appreciate it and enjoy it.
Yeah, Boston is so great for kids. There's the Freedom Trail and the Natural History Museum and the aquarium. I know Boston's great.
Yes, yeah.
Good. Do you get the summer off as a professor, or do you teach classes?
So I'm not teaching any classes, but I'm doing a lot of freelance writing and thinking through my next book idea and doing some trainings for different organizations. So doing more creative work.
Good. Well, I've been looking forward to having this conversation with you today because we have some things in common, beyond the fact that we're both writers, and I congratulate you on finally getting a book finished. And it's really hard to write a memoir, which I've done also, and I'm just trying to put it out there right now. So I think these childhood things, help to prompt us. I want to know what you think about that, but to want to share our story and to hopefully relate to somebody else and help somebody else. And I know reading your book, you always were a reader and a writer, and so was I. But do you think that's true about trying to get your book
Definitely.
out there? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's so much of why I wanted to write this book was so that people could read it and feel like someone understood them on a deeper level. And so often I felt like I was writing this book for myself as a memoirist, but always was thinking about who am I writing this for and how can I make sure that they find points of entry in the book.
Well, definitely. You have a nice combination of memoir and reporting in there. And we're going to talk about Slip. But one of the things two of the things that we really have in common, besides the love of writing, is that both of our mothers died when we were children, right around the same age. I was 10, going on 11, and I think you were 11. Both had metastatic breast cancer, and both of us had eating disorders, and both were ultimately prompted by this loss. And yours was different than mine, completely different than mine, but I still understand the pain of it and the draw of it and the feeling of control it gives you when you feel like your life is out of your control. So, um, anyway, let's unpack all this. And can you tell us about Slip?
Sure. So thank you for sharing that with me. I was really drawn to just the similarities between our stories. And I really, in Slip, try to capture that story. I just really approached it as a book that would be primarily about my own life and my experiences of losing my mother when I was 11 and developing an eating disorder and being treated. But for the longest time, I thought that I had to write this memoir from the perspective of someone who is fully recovered. And so I started working on iterations of this book when I was 17, and every few years I would write different versions. But I thought, well, I'm not fully recovered yet, so I can't really write this book in the way that it needs to be written. But I realized that there could be a lot of value in writing this book as someone who is in what I call the middle place, which is this name I've given to this liminal gray space between acute sickness and full recovery. And this occurred to me after I had written a piece for the New York Times, in which, for the first time, I publicly shared this idea of the middle place. And I had so many people reach out to me to say, I can relate. I am there too. And so that gave me the confidence to say, okay, I don't have to be over my eating disorder in order to write this. I really can write this as someone who is far along in my recovery, but who still has a lot of work to do. So the book really looks at my experiences with that, but I also wanted to expand the scope. In many ways, I fit the stereotypical mold of someone with an eating disorder, and that I live in a smaller body, I identify as female, I'm white, middle to upper class. And so I wanted to be able to include other narratives. So I ended up surveying over 700 people from around the world who have lived experience with eating disorders. And I interviewed 175 survey respondents and researchers and clinicians. So I bring in all of those different perspectives and research into the book alongside my own story, with hopes that it really will be relatable on multiple levels to different folks, and with the hope that people can read my story, but also learn about the evolution of eating disorder care and what we're discovering about the science of eating disorders with regard to how they change the brain and the genetic component. So all of that is woven into the book.
It's so interesting to me that, and I understand this profile. Why is it that the perception is it's white, affluent, usually thin people that have this stereotype of having the eating disorder?
So, there is this really harmful stereotype, and we know it's existed for many years. It's to the point where there's an acronym known as SWAG, skinny, white, affluent girl. And so we do know that, yes, these eating disorders do affect that population. But for many years, that was really the only population that was getting treated, in part because medical doctors don't actually get much, if any, training on eating disorders in med school. They get about 0 to 2 hours of training. And so these stereotypes of the skinny, white, affluent girl are therefore perpetuated. And so many people of different races, genders, body types, they are often overlooked by the medical establishment because they don't fit that stereotype. And so part of it is about this systemic issue of these stereotypes being perpetuated, and therefore people not really being recognized as having an eating disorder. And I think part of it too is because in media, the stories that we typically have heard of people with eating disorders do fit this stereotype. And so that perpetuates it
Mm.
as well. And so there's sort of this confluence of factors that have made us societally believe that there is a quote unquote type of person who struggles with an eating disorder, when in fact we know that everyone can potentially struggle with one, no matter what they actually look like.
Yeah, of course. Well, I would like to circle this back to the beginning of this eating disorder and the beginning of this discussion where um, I have to say, when I read the first chapter of Slip, I got so emotional because it hit me hard. The similarities between us, and what I've even written about my own mother dying at that same time are so similar. And to make it more poignant, I couldn't believe your mother's name was Robin. So
Yes.
that also sort of struck me because now, I find with these things, I look at myself as that teenage girl who was struggling, and I'm a mother now too. And when it goes to the breast cancer, I always had it hanging over my head as the daughter. and now I have a daughter, so now I have to worry about her. I don't have to, but I do. And so it's tough. And the other thing that I just loved in there was your reference to Hope Edelman, who I just adore her. She's been on the show, and I have so much respect for her. So I love that you also talked to her and went to her for a reference in your book. But talk about what happened with your mother, and we're going to work up to how this related to your father seeing somebody else and how that affected the eating disorder. So let's talk about that if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah, so my mom was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer when I was 8 years old, and she was sick for a couple of years, went into a very brief period of remission, but then the cancer ended up coming back and spreading to her bone marrow, her liver, and her brain. So my mom was really a shell of her former self. She was losing weight, she had lost her hair, she was so sick she could barely get out of bed. And even though she was so sick and I could see that, I still always held on to hope that she would be okay because my family very much bought into the warrior language where we would talk about my mom as a soldier in a battle. And we always said that she was going to get out the other side victoriously. She was going to win this battle. And so that was the narrative that we really clung to. And as an 8, 9, 10, 11 year old, I believed it to be true because I didn't really know any better. And I couldn't fathom the idea of my mother actually dying. But when I was 11, she did pass away. And I felt like my whole world had crumbled. And
Mm.
I was in complete shock, even though, again, I had seen her deteriorate. I always thought she'd be okay. And so my father really didn't know how to handle the loss, and so he ended up going to work the next morning. My mom died on a Sunday night, and he went to work the next morning. I walked to middle school alone,
Mm.
and I pretended I was okay. I didn't cry. I remember just going to class and trying to put on a happy face, and I tried to stay calm, cool, and collected. I remember the nurses in my mom's hospital sometimes telling her that. And so I just told myself I had to be strong because my family's definition of strength was really about how much of a happy face you could put on in the midst of sadness. And so I remember just feeling like I was so far away from my mother. I would count the minutes since she had passed, and then the
Mm.
hours and the days and the weeks. And the more time passed, the farther away I felt from my mother. And at the same time, I was in a sixth grade, seventh grade health class where we were learning about quote unquote good foods and bad foods. And we were being told what we should and shouldn't eat. And so I was very quickly learning that I could change the way my body looked based on what I ate. So I conjured up this idea as a 12-year-old that maybe if I stayed the same size I was when my mom was alive, I could somehow be closer to her. And that seems like such a complicated thought for a 12-year-old to have, but I have all of my old journals from that time. And looking back on them, it's very clear that that's what I believed. And so I started to restrict my food intake, not as a way to be skinny, but really as a way to stay small and safe. And so food restriction became almost this warped form of time travel. But
Mm.
eventually it did devolve into me really restricting and then focusing more on my body size and wanting to be as skinny as I could be. But that really led to me developing anorexia and led to many years of treatment, including hospitalizations and residential treatment.
It's how often does it start with kids that young? Because I know for me, and I was never hospitalized. It never got to that point, but mine started at around 17, and I also stuffed away the grief from my mother when she died. Um, my father remarried really quickly, and it just was, I didn't know what to do, and sort of at the time when the griefs finally started to hit me for various reasons, and this anorexia thing happened, for me, it was, without me realizing it, it wasn't so much, it was about being skinny, but it was about this sense of control. And I mean, what set me off was I'd always been the skinny girl. I mean, I got teased. I get called olive oil. I had these long, skinny legs. Like I just was always that was who I thought I was, the skinny girl. And somebody told me at a place where I worked that I could stand to lose 15 pounds, and it just like that just scrambled my brain because I thought, oh, whoa! I always thought I was the skinny girl, and it was as you talk about in your book, it was the trigger and that trigger, like, just sent me down a bad path, and, but anyway, it seemed to me like when I went to college, a lot of girls were dabbling in bulimia and the anorexia, but it seemed like bulimia more, and so for me, I started it in high school and continued in college till I finally had my breakdown and saw a psychiatrist who is he helped me get over it, but get over it's the wrong word, I know, based on your book, but, yeah, anyway, I'm just curious about having this happen so young, and is that unusual?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned olive oil because I haven't thought of that detail in a while, but my mother used to call me that as well. But yeah, I mean, we're seeing earlier and earlier onsets of eating disorders. The median age of eating disorders or the median age of onset is college age people, but we do know that these disorders can really take shape at very young ages. There's research showing that children as young as 5 years old are already developing preoccupations around their bodies. And many of the clinicians who I interviewed for the book have talked about how they are treating patients who are 9 years old. And so we're seeing that younger and younger children are developing these disorders, but really they can take shape at any point in time, even amongst people who are in their 50s, 60s, 70s. So I think that it's important to recognize that just in the ways that we sometimes think, oh, well, these are just disorders that affect skinny white girls. Sometimes we think, oh, these are just disorders that people have in college, but really they can take shape at any point.
Well, with a kid that young, is it is there something that triggers it, or is it, something in their, neurological, makeup? Like, what do you think triggers a child that young,
Yeah.
who hasn't had maybe their mother die or a tragedy or is it usually based on something like that triggering them, a trauma?
A lot of times, trauma is at the root of it. Not always. Sometimes there are incidences in which a child will have a choking incident and then they become afraid to eat. And so they stop eating. And once their body gets into an energy deficit, it then creates these psychological changes that then kind of make them devolve into an eating disorder. And so it's always hard to pinpoint exactly what it is that triggers an eating disorder, but there are usually kind of four factors that determine whether or not someone will develop an eating disorder over the course of their lifetime. And those factors are genetic risk factors, genetic protective factors, and then environmental risk factors and environmental protective factors. So there may be a child, for instance, who experiences a trauma, but maybe they don't really have any sort of genetic risk. And so they're therefore able to move on. They don't develop an eating disorder. There may be someone who's more genetically predisposed to developing an eating disorder, but they don't experience a trauma that incites it. And so it's really sort of this combination of factors that comes into play. But sometimes it can be something as innocuous as someone making a comment about their body or them choking on food and therefore being afraid to eat.
Well, when you talk about a genetic predisposition, I know in your book you talk about the fact that I mean there's certain things people who are perfectionists, people who are very persistent, people who are detail oriented. There's different things because it seems you have to have a certain makeup to be successful at counting all your calories, researching all that, memorizing all that. Like for me, I had every calorie memorized. I carried around a little calorie counter book And literally, I had this burn rate thing going with like, I ate a carrot. So then I should go out and run. I was a runner and burn that off. And I know you talk about the jumping in your book, and then the running, but that was my thing where I had it all figured out. And so when you talk about the genetic disposition, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, the genetic disposition definitely involves temperament traits. So things like rigidity, perfectionism, tendency to have black and white thinking. We know that those temperament traits are very often at the heart of people with eating disorders and particularly restrictive eating disorders. So certainly the temperament traits are part of it, but there's also just really fascinating genetic research being done looking at sort of different types of genes that can contribute to eating disorders. So there's not one genetic sort of gene. There's no eating disorder gene. So people, I think, can take comfort in knowing that even if they have an eating disorder, it doesn't mean that their children are genetically doomed. And so that's really important to note. But there really are these interesting studies looking at this genetic kind of crossover, if you will, between people with eating disorders and people struggling with other common comorbidities like obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, anxiety. And I think that as we kind of move farther along in research for eating disorders, we're really going to be able to learn even more about the genetics and maybe get a better sense of how many individuals who are struggling, how many of them will actually go on to develop sort of sustained eating disorders versus how many won't. And so right now we're not there yet with the research, but it gives me a lot of hope in terms of thinking about how that research might help us to just be able to advance treatments for eating disorders. And maybe one day, too, we will have pharmacological treatments, right? There's no FDA approved drug to treat anorexia, for instance. But there are, lots of weight loss drugs. So it's just interesting to see there's so much more emphasis typically on kind of treating obesity as opposed to actually treating eating disorders. And we know, of course, there's overlap between those two groups. But there's a lot of great work being done, but so much more that needs to happen as well.
Well, I wanna go back to talking about, what happened after your mother died and your father and him starting to see, his first girlfriend. But before we I just this is just me having a question because I saw something recently about this and I thought, "Oh, no, this could be a really tough thing." But I read that, all the GLP-1 stuff is also affecting people who have eating disorders because it then creates an even easier way to not eat. So I'm just really quick, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think GLP-1 drugs can be very effective for people. So I never want to say that they're bad because they can help, but they also can really hurt a lot of people who are either in recovery from an eating disorder or susceptible to developing one, especially with these kind of compound drugs. They're so easy to access. People can buy them online. And I've talked with clinicians who have said that many of their patients are relapsing because they're going to parties where GLP weight loss drugs are readily accessible.
Mm.
And so I think we really need to be thinking about that population of people who probably should not be getting these drugs or who will need extra support if for some reason they do need to get on them.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that's a giant discussion we could have, but all right, well, let's circle back to after your mother died and now you've started having this eating disorder and now your father tells you he's starting to see somebody. So, can you talk about that? And
Yes. So I'm so glad you asked because this is not a topic I get asked about a lot. And I've given lots of talks about the book, but I think it's really important because, particularly for those who have lost their parents, they know that it can be really difficult to see the ways in which the family dynamic changes after that. And for me, it was so difficult to see my father start to date because I was still very much stuck in denial and hadn't really even processed my grief yet. And there, my father was beginning to date again about a year after my mother had passed. And I was too young to really understand why he would have dated someone else. I always thought, well, doesn't he still love my mom? And when he started dating, I really thought that that meant that maybe he didn't love my mom. And there were also felt like this disconnect because in dating, I saw that my father was moving on in ways that I couldn't. I still very much felt stuck in the past and was unsure of how to move forward. And so when my father started dating, I would give him these ultimatums. And at that point, I had begun restricting a little bit, largely kind of based off of what I was learning in health class. And of course, because of my mom's death. But I hadn't really kind of developed a full fledged eating disorder at that point. But I began to tell my father that I would eat if he stopped dating his girlfriend and I would stop eating if he continued to date her. And he said, I'm going to continue dating her, but I don't want you to stop eating. But I really took that as just ammunition to just start restricting even more because that was, again, a way for me to feel like I had some semblance of control in the midst of this situation that felt increasingly outside of my control.
And well, when you look back on that now, how do you feel about that and the position your dad was in? And also, it was extra hard because you were an only child. So it was just your dad and you. And now he's seeing somebody else. So where does that leave you? I know. But looking back now, what do you think about that?
I understand my father so much more now as a parent myself, and I have a really good relationship with him as an adult. And I understand why he would have wanted to begin dating again. And for him, it was a way to be able to move on. But I think it was also part of him processing his grief and realizing that he didn't want to be stuck anymore. He wanted to continue to be able to live his life, and that was important to him. But he also, I know, wrestled with the reality that dating was somehow making me sicker. And
Mm.
so I think that he realized also that if he stopped dating his girlfriend, I probably wasn't going to start eating again. I sort of had fallen kind of very quickly into the disorder. And I think he could tell it was hard for me or would be hard for me to get out of it. So I have a lot of empathy for my dad, but I think I still have a lot of empathy for young Mallory too. And I think about how angry I was, and anger was not a feeling that I really knew what to do with. And so I didn't tell my father that I was angry, but I showed it in other ways. I remember one time my father's girlfriend had bought him a bunch of shampoo and conditioner because she was a hairdresser. And so one night I just put it all down the drain and I threw out the bottles. And that was sort of my innocent way of rebelling at the time. But I just had so much anger. And as you mentioned, I would jump. That was my form of obsessive exercise. And so on the nights when he and his girlfriend, who was named Katie, would go out, I would just spend the whole time jumping at home because it was a release for that anger. And it was a release because it felt like a way for me to be able to have some sort of kind of control over my body, some sort of power. And it really did, in a lot of ways, fuel that disordered thinking and those disordered behaviors.
And I'm just wondering too, because you were, a good girl, it sounds like. You were young, you were a good girl, you loved your parents, you loved your father. So instead of really doing anything harmful to him, you were harmful to yourself. And I'm just wondering about that, and what that means with people with eating disorders. Is that common where instead of, lashing out to the world, it goes internally? And um, I'll bet that's very common. I know in my case, I feel like that's what happened too.
Yes, it is common for sure. A lot of people with eating disorders are not necessarily articulating how they're feeling, but they're very much internalizing it. And the body in some ways becomes a mechanism for speaking what they cannot say aloud. So I think about how after my mom died, people praised me for being strong and resilient, and they didn't seem to recognize that I needed help. But once I got sick, I got so unhealthy looking that my body spoke for me. And suddenly people started to realize, oh, Mallory needs help. Something's not right. And so, in some ways, anorexia served that purpose of showing that I wasn't okay. But it took a whole lot of struggle and bodily harm to get to that point because even though I have always identified as a writer and I've always loved words, I couldn't articulate the words that I needed to in order to be able to ask for help.
So is this the only time you had people to talk to outside your father since you did not have siblings? Did you have anybody else, an aunt or a close friend of your mother's who you could confide in? Or was this it? This was the way you could get some real help, somebody to talk
I
to?
Yeah, I had people in my life, but my family is very small. And so I didn't have a big family unit. I talk often about this with my husband because when his father died when he was 14, he had a whole revolving door of family members who would be coming in and out of the house, bringing casseroles for a good week or two. And there was none of that in my house.
Mm,
Nobody really was making casseroles or showing up. The day after my mom died, I came home to an empty house.
mhm.
So I didn't really have that as an only child growing up in a small family. I did have my maternal grandmother, but she was really, I think, still dealing with her own loss and trying to grapple with that. And then eventually, my father's mother, she entered into our lives more. She lived about 2 hours away, but she started to live with us for about 3 days a week, particularly once I started to get sick because she knew my father needed extra help. And so I certainly had her as a source of comfort, but I didn't really feel like I could confide in her in terms of the eating disorder
Mm.
because eating disorders are so enigmatic. And I found that it was really hard for my father and grandmother to get it, even though they really wanted to. And I knew that they wanted to help me.
Well, one of the things that just struck me in what you said is that your husband's father died when he was 14. And I don't know if that, when you learned that fact about him, if that, um, there was something about that with him that drew you together because my husband's mother died when he was 5 of breast cancer. And the first night we met, we talked about that fact because you don't meet people that often whose parents have died when they're children. And, that was ironically, that's something that drew us together. And now having a daughter, extra worry because both of our mothers died in their 30s of breast cancer. And now now I'm worried about my daughter having the double dose of that. But anyway, it was definitely something that drew us together. Is that true with you at all with your husband?
Yes, very much so. We actually talked about it on our first date as well. And when I opened up about my mom, he then told me about his father dying in a motorcycle accident. And
Mm,
immediately it felt like we just had so much more in common that I thought we would at the onset. And I found that I just instantly was developing a deeper connection with him because we were able to talk about loss and our shared experiences with that really early on. And
mm.
so, yeah, that certainly did help us to be connected. And I've also just been struck by how differently we grieved, right? And how differently our families responded.
S-
So,
Same.
yeah, yeah,
Very same, completely different with my husband. His family was more like yours, and my family was more like your husband's, it sounds like. Um, but I do wanna keep us on track because of the whole step story thing, since a lot of people are listening about that side of it. So, I have to say, oh my gosh, when I read the part in your book about your dad coming to the residential treatment facility where you were to tell you he was going to marry Katie, it just was excruciating to read that and read your pain. You wrote that so well, and what happened. So will you talk about that part of the book and that
sure.
experience for yourself? Yeah.
Yes. So I was in residential treatment. I was there for about a year and a half getting treated for anorexia. And my father and Katie would come for family therapy sessions. And it was really in residential treatment that my therapist encouraged me to try to talk with Katie because initially, when she would come to these family therapy sessions, I would literally sit with my head in my hands and I would be shaking my leg and I wouldn't make any sort of eye contact with her. I wouldn't even lift
Mm,
up my head. And so we were starting with a lot of work to do. And over the months, I began to keep my head up, even though I wouldn't look at her. And eventually got to the point where I could look at her and say a few words to her. But it was that hard for me at that age to acknowledge her. And even though she was a very good person, it had nothing to do with her. It was more so about the situation. But my father, during one of those sessions, told me that he had proposed to Katie and that they were going to get married. And I just remember running out of my therapist's office and going down the hall and just crying my eyes out. I just felt sadness. I felt anger, confusion. Because I was in residential treatment at the time, I was really closed off from the outside world. So I didn't have a great sense of how close they had actually gotten. And so
mm,
they were living their life out there, and I was confined to this treatment center that felt very insulated. And so my therapist ended up taking me to this padded timeout room. There were many of them on the treatment grounds. And she took me to the biggest one that the treatment center had. And there was a woman there who ran that particular timeout center. And she had stacks of telephone books. And she would often give them to other girls at the treatment center who just needed to do something with their rage and their anger. And so she gave them to me, and I just started tearing them apart. And I was ripping out all of the pages, to the point where my hands were just black with ink. And then she was giving me kind of this punching bag, and I was just punching it until my knuckles bled. I mean, I was so surprised by how much anger was in me because
mm,
like you said, had always been a good girl. I never showed anger. But it felt like I had gotten out about 3 years of anger and sadness. And my therapist made a comment along those lines because it had been 3 years since my mom had
mm.
passed by that point. But I think I needed to do that in some ways in order to be able to really just finally get in touch with my feelings. And that was the catalyst for it. And I didn't end up seeing my dad again that night. He ended up driving home, and it took a little while for us to really talk about what that meant, but being able to let out all those feelings was helpful. And I wrote about it in the book with help from my journals because I had just a super detailed journal entry about that specific night.
Mm.
And the writer in me is so grateful for that because it really helped me to corroborate memory and bring in these vivid details that I had since forgotten.
Was that a turning point for you at all? Do you
It
think? By being able to release all of that rage?
I think it was. I mean, I think it showed me that I did have these emotions and that it was okay to release them. And it also helped me to realize that I couldn't stay stuck in the past when the world around me was very much moving forward. Because I think that I realized in that moment that because I had tried to stay little for so long, because I was trying to stop time, I had really lost sight of the present day. And I
Mm,
didn't want to be blindsided like that again.
mhm.
Yeah.
Um, well, and then I know that well, I don't so I hope it's okay. Spoiler alert that your dad didn't end up marrying Katie, and then somebody else came along. And I'm just curious with that what happened because, this now he's got a new person in your life, a new replacement mom. So what happened with that?
Yes, yes. And So he didn't marry Katie, as you said. She wanted children and he didn't. And I will just say, too, I've since reconnected with Katie. I got in touch with her before writing the book and I apologized for some of the ways that I acted. And she was so gracious and said, "You were so young, Mallory." She said, "I couldn't imagine all that you were going through." And she said, "I understand." And so that was a really healing part of the writing process. But my father did end up dating a new woman when I was in high school. So it was shortly after I had left residential treatment and I was back in school and back at home. And he was dating her for about a year and then ended up letting me know again that he was getting engaged. But this time he was more tentative about it. I think he was a little scarred by that first experience of telling me that he was engaged to Katie. So he actually wrote a letter. He printed out two copies of the same letter and he gave one to me and one to my paternal grandmother. This was while I was on Thanksgiving break during my freshman year of college. And he said, "I want you to read this note in its entirety before saying anything." And then he promptly went downstairs to play his guitar. He was so uncomfortable, I think, by the
Yeah.
prospect of just even seeing us read the letter. But I read the letter, and in some ways, it felt like I was regressing to my younger self, but I just could not believe it again. I felt like, "Oh, here we are again." And even though I was older, I was a freshman in college, I still just had difficulty coming to terms with this idea that he was going to be getting married. And so I went to my bedroom door and I slammed the door. And it felt like, I write about this in the book, that I could almost hear anorexia knocking, right? I
Mm.
remember being in my bedroom that night and just feeling that urge to jump and exercise and not eat, even though I had done so much work in treatment and I was in a really good place in my recovery. It just felt like that was another instance in which the disorder was beckoning. And so when they did get remarried when I was a sophomore, or actually end of freshman year of college, I did end up relapsing. And I am always careful to say that it's not as though my stepmother or their marriage is what caused the relapse. It was sort of a confluence of factors, but certainly it still was very difficult for me to grapple with. And it was one of the factors that I think led me to re engage with the disorder.
So, how did you get to a place where, and I know this is the whole point of the book, the middle place, but how did you get to a place where you finally were able to just handle things? And I don't know the right terms to say on this, but to get to a comfortable place for you?
So I was really kind of stuck in this cycle of binge eating and restricting all throughout college and for several years after the fact. And throughout that time, I got to know my stepmother better. And so that wasn't really a contributing factor so much. It was more so that I was just really stuck in this cycle that I didn't feel like I could get out of. And I remember thinking that there was this huge disconnect between the story that I was sharing with the world and the one that I was living out behind closed doors,
Mm.
because I told everyone, including my father and my stepmother, that I was fully recovered. And because I was binge eating and restricting, I wasn't losing weight. I had even gained a little bit of weight. So it didn't look like I was sick. And I was very good at hiding my behaviors. But behind closed doors, I was very much struggling. And I felt like I was failing at anorexia and failing at full recovery. And it wasn't until my mid 20s that I started working for a nonprofit. And I was tasked with helping journalists tell what we called restorative narratives, which are these stories that show how people and communities make meaningful progress in the aftermath of trauma or tragedy or illness. And so I was encouraging journalists to tell stories about the messy middles of people's lives, which often get overlooked in media. And about a year into this work, it occurred to me that this could actually be a really helpful framework for thinking about my own narrative because I thought, what if rather than trying to achieve this perfect full recovery, which I kept trying to do, but felt like I was always failing at, what if I could look at my recovery as more of this middle place where slips happen and progress is also possible? Because when I was stuck in the binge restrict cycle, it felt like every time I slipped by binge eating or restricting, it would just turn into this slide. And those slides really started to feel uncontrollable. But I thought, what if I slipped, but then realized, okay, I don't have to let this turn into a slide. I can get back up again. So I then kind of came to develop this middle place idea and really started to kind of think through it and talk about it. At that same time, I met the man who I would eventually marry. And so I was then, in some ways, forced to be a little bit more open about my disorder because it was harder to hide. And so I started to tell him, I'm actually not fully recovered. I struggled with a childhood eating disorder and I'm trying to make progress, but I'm still struggling with a lot of aspects of it. So removing the stigma and shame around the fact that I was still struggling, coupled with this idea that recovery was imperfect in the middle place, I think really helped me to be able to move forward. Sounds like the dog is cheering me on.
The dog is cheering you on. Luna, oh
Sweet.
boy. I guess because we are at the end of the interview, I'm just wondering what kind of wisdom you can share with people who have unresolved grief. They're struggling with self-harming ways, that could also help somebody who has a child or a stepchild or knows somebody struggling with this. What kinds of, um, I hate to use the word advice, but you are an expert in this area now. So what would you say to help them?
I mean, I think a big part of it is recognizing that grief ebbs and flows and grief never really goes away. I think about this a lot because my book came out when I was 40, which is the same age that my mom was when I passed away. And so it feels like this really poignant moment. But I just turned 41 a couple weeks ago, and now I have really officially outlived my mother because she
Mhm.
died when she was about 40 and 8 months. And so I thought, wow, I really was just struck by how sad I felt on this last birthday. And I thought, there's the grief, right? It's still there. And so I think it's really important to recognize that we always carry the load of loss and we don't have to arrive at a place of closure. So, similar to how I've not yet arrived at a place of full recovery with my eating disorder, I've never arrived at a place of closure with my loss. And I've come to accept that as being okay because the load of that loss has lightened over time. So, it's still something I shoulder, but it's more bearable. And so, I think that just being able to recognize that and really opening up space for storytelling about loved ones who have been lost is really important. And I think that's really important too for folks who maybe are playing the role of a step parent, because I know it was hard for me to kind of accept that my dad was getting remarried. But as a parent now, I can really feel for step parents and how difficult
Mhm.
that is for them to step into that role. And so I just want to hold space for that and acknowledge that too. But I think that for folks in that role, it can be really helpful, particularly if they are the step parents of a child who lost their parent, to say, "Tell me about your parent." Right? What were they like? What are some of your favorite memories with your parent? And really invite that dialogue because I think people are afraid to go there. A lot of people just don't ask me about my mom, but if only they knew. I love talking about my mom. I mean, I could talk about her all the time. So I love when people ask me about her. And I feel like I can keep her memory alive through my writing, which is a real gift. But all of that I think is so important. And I'll just say too that for anyone who's struggling with an eating disorder or for anyone who has a loved one struggling, it's always really important to continue that conversation about recovery. Because I remember at one point during one of my book talks, my father actually was in the audience and he asked a question and he said, "In college, I thought that you were fine and that you were all better. I didn't realize that you were struggling again." And he said, "What advice do you have for parents who may think that their kids are okay, but they're really not?" And that was this really powerful question. But my response to it, which I talked more about with my dad, was just that you keep asking, right? Even if your child seems okay, even if it seems like they're quote unquote over their disorder, keep checking in, keep asking, because you never know when that one question may open up avenues for storytelling about the messiness of recovery and the ways in which it's not going so well. So I think continuing to talk about grief, continuing to talk about recovery, rather than thinking of them as things of the past is really important.
Thank you for all that you said because so many of the things you just said are things that we say a lot on this show. As the person suffering, do not bottle it up. Try to find somebody if you can. And it sounds like you really didn't have anybody to confide into. Don't hide it. Also, if you have stories or know anything about somebody whose parent has passed away, definitely talk about it, bring it up because the loved ones left behind, particularly children of the parent who's passed, really appreciate that. And I just think everything you've talked about here has so much wisdom beyond just the eating disorder. It's just a child suffering after the loss of a parent, and I do agree. I've learned so much more about stepmothers and step parents and how hard it is, and we're hard on them as children who are grieving, and I was too. But those grieving children need so much love and need to be able to talk about things. So that's just my wisdom also for step parents. So anyway, on a brighter note, anything else up for you that you're excited about that you're working on?
So there's actually a Spanish translation of my book that's coming out in June. And so I'm excited about that just because there's so few eating disorder resources for Spanish speaking individuals. And then the paperback release comes out in August. So doing some events around that and starting to think about my next book idea. So it feels like this very creative and fun time.
That's wonderful. Well, I'm excited for you and I appreciate you coming on the show and being so honest and talking about all this because it's really important. And I really hope it's helped somebody who's listening and can pass this along, share this episode, and we will have all of your information in the show notes. And please buy her book, Slip. And I need to get the final say the name, the full name right now. Life in the middle of you say it.
Yes, slip life in the middle of eating disorder recovery.
That's it. It's not just also, I will say, um, you don't have to buy it if you're dealing with eating disorder. It's just a wonderful, wonderful memoir about a young girl struggling with the loss of her mother and how she gets through this really difficult time and how her family gets through it. So I highly recommend it. And thank you again so much, Mallory. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Robin.